The Catholic Church is the longest standing contiguous institution in all of human history, which has to raise questions like how has it managed to do this? It must either be the most brilliantly organized institution in the world, or there must be some other extremely powerful insight helping it along, keeping it alive, and preserving it from the kinds of adversities that have ended far more formidable societies and organizations of the past. And in my limited exposure, but also from lessons of history, what couldn't be more obvious is that the church cannot take credit for its longevity because it is a brilliantly governed organization or institution. Hilaire Beloc once famously said, "A proof of the divine origins of the Catholic Church might be found in the fact that no merely human institution conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight." In fact, when the church prioritizes its institutional dimensions and seeks to govern itself like any other worldly institution, that's exactly when its institutional prosperity seems to suffer the most. And this is dramatically apparent on the question of altar servers. Historically, only males were allowed to serve in various liturgical functions at Mass, or what we just now commonly call altar servers. This was a practice that had endured for as long as the church has had altar servers, which again, when an institution or society defies all the odds by enduring longer than any of its rivals or its peers, you'd think its long-standing practices would be treated with care considering their longevity. But most recently in the church's history, in that particular segment of history we happen to be living through right now, this was a practice that had become seen as unjust and discriminatory, not because of something within our tradition, but because of something from without, namely the spirit and practices of the modern world, which obviously doesn't have this same record of longevity. In fact, it seems like nothing in the modern world lasts for very long. So I think it's worth taking a bit of a critical lens to the logic behind this shift in the church. And the first place to start should be by asking the very obvious question, why do we have altar servers? If you were thinking in merely institutional terms, you might say, to perform the work on the altar. They assist the priest to perform his liturgical functions. And girls can do that just as well as boys, so any form of discrimination on that count is obviously unjust. But that is emphatically not why we have altar servers. The priest's actions and functions on the altar are not so complicated that the distinctive skills and knowledge of 12-year-old boys and girls are necessary to rescue him from these complexities. The priest is more than capable of celebrating Mass by himself, and if necessary, he does sometimes. So why bother having adolescent altar servers assisting in the sanctuary? It isn't because it's so demanding that he can't do it himself, it's because it gives young people intimate exposure to the most profound work of priests in their vocation, so that they might consider it for themselves. Because at the end of the day, unless we're finding ways to encourage young men to consider becoming priests, there is no future for the Catholic Church. And what better way of exposing young men to this vocation and the graces that come with it than by giving them the kind of work exposure that altar serving affords? Not to mention the rare opportunities to get a behind-the-scenes look at the work and life of the priests that they assist. And this is just so obviously how most careers are chosen. Most people choose their careers because they had some exposure to a person in that line of work, or because they had some work experience themselves in that line of work. And I can share both anecdotally and statistically how this principle tends to bear out. First, anecdotally, my oldest son started altar serving a couple years ago, and almost immediately after he became comfortable in that role, he started saying that he wanted to become a priest when he grows up. Now, a couple years later, he's still persisting in that intention. Prior to altar serving, that wasn't really on his radar as far as we could tell, even though we would suggest it to him whenever the conversation about his future would come up. His experience of being up there on the altar, taking part in something that matters to him, performing a task that is profound with great pride and diligence, that experience has stirred up his heart to want to serve in this way more fully, or as fully as possible, as an ordained priest. But if his place had been taken by a girl, or just as often a middle-aged or elderly woman, that discernment likely wouldn't have happened. And the same is true for his peers. He serves alongside an impressive cast of boys and men who have all likely given far more space for the priesthood in their vocational discernment than they otherwise would have if the church didn't use this mechanism to expose them to their priestly or to the priestly vocation. If half or more of that caste or the positions of altar serving in our parish was composed of females, that would have, if not more, the number of young men discerning the priesthood in our community. And statistically, this is undeniable. If we're going to wring our hands about a vocational crisis in the church, then this is the test of how serious we are about fixing this problem. Because studies have shown that experienced altar serving directly correlates to priestly vocations. Here in Canada, where I live, the Benedict XVI Institute recently released a comprehensive study about vocations in Canada, which will yield similar results in the United States. In surveys they conducted with recently ordained priests, they asked them about ways they were involved in the parish prior to joining the seminary, and the number one thing they reported as influential in their discernment was altar serving. Most priests surveyed served as altar servers prior to becoming priests, and identify it as one of the things that influenced their discernment. And we shouldn't need comprehensive research to tell us that. Some things are just self-evident unless we're too blinded by some alternative theory or ideology, which sadly does seem to be a bit of our problem. We've taken a list of goods and priorities for the church, one of which is obviously having priests, but then we allowed others to creep in from the outside, from other creeds and ideologies like equality and inclusion, or trying to be more appealing to modern sensibilities. And we've said, you know what? Having priests is a lesser priority to these other goods. Or we just naively assumed we could shoehorn in these other doctrines and priorities and not have it affect the vitality and succession of the church's clergy. Well, we've been doing it for long enough now that the data is coming in, and it's not encouraging. It's kind of scary, actually. There aren't enough seminarians to replace the current crop of priests, which is already a desperately low number. But speaking of these other priorities, are they even goods worthy of sacrificing other goods that the church has relied upon for millennia? When girls have something that is exclusively their own, do we look at that and say, what an injustice? What about diversity? What about inclusion? Do we say these female-only spaces need to be confiscated and opened up to the boys? I hope the answer is no. Usually, if I see something that is exclusively reserved for girls, I find it easy to celebrate the fact that it exists. But when boys have something all their own, our first instinct as a society seems to be to take it away from them and open it up to girls as well in the name of diversity and inclusion. We just saw this happen actually with the Boy Scouts. But the Girl Guides haven't come under that kind of pressure, and they are still exclusively reserved for girls. This appetite for confiscating any male-only spaces while preserving female-only spaces is obviously not about justice or equality, but the actual worst forms of discrimination that these measures are supposedly fighting against. But wherever it comes from, it's not from within the church's tradition, but pressing in from the outside. It's the conventions of the modern world that prevail in institutions like in corporations. But the church isn't an institution, and the more it acts like one, the more it will suffer the fate of all former human institutions, which is ultimately demise. But again, the church isn't an institution. The church is a glimpse or a foreshadowing of God's kingdom here on earth. Jesus, he didn't say the institution of God or the bureaucracy of God is at hand. He said the kingdom of God is at hand. And what is a kingdom? A kingdom is a hierarchy. And a hierarchy distinguishes and even discriminates between its members. And that's a good thing when done justly. Discrimination is such a taboo word, but all it means is drawing distinctions between things that are different. And guess what? Men and women are different. To refuse to discriminate them in appropriate ways is to impose an unjust standard whereby we impose these expectations on women and men to exhibit strengths and behaviors that don't come naturally to them. The church is much more like God's natural created order, which also discriminates against its members. There are experiences and abilities that God specifically ordained exclusively for women and for men. For example, only women can become pregnant and give birth, and only men can tell dad jokes.
All right, you guys, how was everything?
hated it.
So in conventional institutions, we might be able to create an artificial order in which the distinctions between men and women seem irrelevant, but the church's mission isn't here to establish artificial environments that ignore God's created order. God created men and women with different strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to us, those of us who are devoted to following God and to discovering his plan for our lives, to honor and live within those distinctions. God's kingdom is far more like a family than it is like Walmart, and that's a good thing. If you can admit that the priesthood should be reserved for men only, then admitting that the kind of work experience, training, and mentorship that altar serving affords in the service of that vocation should also be male only, that should be obvious. The only reason you'd want to diversify that practice within the church is if your loyalties lie more so with doctrines of the world, like absolute egalitarianism, than they do with the good of the church. Or you're ignoring how necessary this practice is to the benefit of priestly vocations. Neither of those reasons seem to be very good to me. The benefits of taking altar serving away from boys exclusively, as far as I can tell, are negligible, if any at all, for the church. It might help us fit in with the modern world a little more, but let's be honest here. For people who think discrimination is wrong according to these categories, throwing altar servers under the bus to appease their outrage isn't going to distract them from the very conspicuous fact that we still have a male-only priesthood. Meanwhile, the cost here is significant. We're jeopardizing the availability of the sacraments by dismantling one of the best resources we had for recruiting young men into the priesthood. This is abundantly obviously at this point. The only question is, do we now have the courage to be countercultural by adopting a practice that non-Catholics, who seemingly have no interest in becoming Catholic anyways, will denounce us for? Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year, and if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.